In 1965, almost nobody expected this country to survive. No army worth mentioning, no natural resources, no fresh water of its own. A population of immigrants with no shared history dropped onto a swamp island barely the size of a mid-sized city and thrown out of a union with its only neighbor because nobody believed it could stand on its own. 60 years later, that island has one of the highest per capita incomes on Earth, richer than the country that colonized it. Meanwhile, the giants around it, resource-rich, population-rich, history-rich, are still fighting to escape middle-income status. This is the story of how Singapore got rich, and why almost none of its neighbors did. Rewind to August 1965. Singapore is expelled from Malaysia. Overnight, it became an independent country. Nobody asked to be independent. At the time, it was a tiny, impoverished island with a diverse population of recent immigrants who shared little common history. It had been colonized, occupied, and fought over for more than a century, and it sat in a region being pulled hard by communist insurgencies on almost every side. It depended on the outside world for its food, its energy, and its water. Unemployment sat near 9%. Compare that to its neighbors at the time. Malaysia had rubber, tin, and palm oil. Indonesia had oil, gas, timber, and 200 million people. The Philippines had, on paper, one of the strongest economies in Asia, inherited American infrastructure, an educated, English-speaking workforce, and a head start most of the region envied. By every conventional measure, Singapore should have been the poorest of the group. It became the richest. The standard explanation starts with one man, Lee Kuan Yew. His government built its growth model on a specific combination: low taxes, simple regulation, open trade, and strong protection of property rights, which together pulled in sustained waves of private investment that neighboring economies struggled to attract. But there's a second, quieter ingredient that gets less attention: social stability by design. Lee's insistence on managed coexistence between Singapore's Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities spared the country the ethnic violence and political fracturing that repeatedly derailed growth elsewhere in the region. That second point matters more than people think. Malaysia's economic policy has for decades been shaped around race-based redistribution frameworks. Indonesia spent much of the late 20th century managing regional separatism, religious tension, and periodic mass unrest. The Philippines cycled through coups, insurgencies, and elite family politics that repeatedly reset its economic trajectory. Singapore, by contrast, ran one government, one long-term plan, uninterrupted for half a century. That consistency came at a real cost. This wasn't a liberal democracy delivering these results. It was a tightly controlled one-party system, where press freedom was limited and political opposition was systematically weakened. Singapore's economic miracle and its authoritarian model were not separate stories. They were the same story. Here's the part most explainer videos skip. Singapore didn't invent its geography. It sits directly on the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet, a position traders have exploited since before European colonization even began. That is not a policy achievement. It's an accident of latitude and longitude. Some economists push back hard on the visionary leadership alone narrative for exactly this reason. Cities that get rich off trade hub geography, Singapore, historic Amsterdam, historic Venice, tends to have that advantage baked in centuries before any specific government shows up to take credit for it. Good governance didn't create Singapore's strategic position. It capitalized on one that already existed. So the honest answer sits in between the two extremes. Geography gave Singapore a door. Policy is what decided whether anyone walked through it, and neighboring ports with similarly useful locations, without the same institutional discipline, didn't convert that potential into the same outcome. So why didn't the giants catch up? Academic research into the region's divergence points to one dominant factor: sustained political disruption. Across Southeast Asia, the gap in income between the richest and poorest states largely traces back to which countries suffered major, prolonged instability, wars, kleptocratic governments, and leadership more focused on ideology or foreign policy than on economic fundamentals. Colonial administrative legacy plays a role too. Singapore and Malaysia both inherited British common law and bureaucratic institutions. Indonesia inherited a very different Dutch administrative structure, and the Philippines inherited Spanish, then American systems. None of this alone explains the gap, but it shaped what each country's institutions looked like on day one of independence. And then there's simple continuity of governance. Singapore's master plan system reviews and updates national development every 5 years, inside a framework that has run uninterrupted since the 1960s. Compare that to a country like South Korea, where a change in government has historically been enough to unwind an entire policy direction built by the previous administration. Multiply that instability across 6 decades and multiply it across a much larger, more diverse population, and the compounding gap becomes obvious. Here's where that gap stands right now. Singapore, 6 million people, roughly a $565 billion economy, and the highest GDP per capita in the region at close to $93,000. Indonesia, the regional giant by size, a $1.4 trillion economy and 284 million people, but a GDP per capita of only around $5,000, still behind regional peers like Malaysia and Thailand. Malaysia sits in the middle, around $13,000 per capita. The Philippines trails further behind. Vietnam, meanwhile, is the one genuine disruption story in the region right now, rapidly emerging as Southeast Asia's new manufacturing hub and posting some of its fastest growth. And the divergence isn't just historical, it's still happening in real time. Through the first half of 2026, Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam have led regional growth. Malaysia and Thailand have expanded more steadily, and the Philippines has been the clear laggard, with growth slowing to its weakest pace since the pandemic. So was it luck, or was it design? The honest answer, both, in a sequence that mattered. Singapore had a geographic accident it didn't create. What it did create was the political stability, institutional consistency, and policy discipline to actually convert that accident into sustained wealth. For 6 uninterrupted decades, without the wars, coups, and racial politics that repeatedly reset its neighbours' progress. The uncomfortable question this leaves for the rest of the region isn't, why aren't we like Singapore? It's whether any of them are structurally capable of the one thing Singapore actually had that they didn't: 60 years without the state itself becoming the disruption.